Welcome to our last fall talk for the 2025 semester. We are very lucky today to have Bill McKibben. Bill McKibben is a contributing writer to The New Yorker and a founder of Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 60 to work on climate and racial justice. He founded the first global grassroots climate campaign, 350.org, and serves as the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. In 2014, he was awarded the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, by the Swedish Parliament. He's also won the Gandhi Peace Award and honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities. He has written over a dozen books about the environment. His first, The End of Nature, was published in 1989. His latest book is called The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. Please join me in welcoming Bill McKibben.
Well, thank you very much, and what a great pleasure to be here. I say that in part because it's just the good excuse to finally get home to Vermont. I've been on the road all fall organizing. My wife, I think with a certain amount of intent, calculated the other night that I'd been in 71 different hotel rooms in the last 77 nights. So it actually would be a great lifestyle if I didn't like my wife, but I do, so it's been problematic. And it's very good to be home, at least close to home. I woke up this morning at home in Ripton and got in a beautiful ski through the woods up at Breadloaf. But then I'm off, the second we leave here, off across the ferry at Charlotte over to the Adirondacks to give a talk over at Paul Smith's tonight. But I'm getting closer to home, which is very, very good for me. The reason I've been out and around so much is twofold. One, actually, my most recent book is actually just came out this fall called Here Comes the Sun, a title, obviously, that I stole from George Harrison. And it's all about the topic that I'll be working on today. But mostly I've been out sort of organizing this fall. First for this thing that we called Sun Day, which I'll tell you a little bit about, not Earth Day, but Sun Day. And second for No King's Day. I got to be in the town where I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, giving the talk on the green on No King's Day, which was great fun because Lexington Green was arguably the site of the first No Kings protest back in 1775. And then we were organizing around the elections, and I'll talk about that a little bit too. Let me say that my life's work really has been spent around this question of climate. The book I wrote back in the 1980s, The End of Nature, was the first book about what we then called the greenhouse effect and what we now call the climate crisis. And ever since, in one way or another, that's what I've spent my life working on. And so I'll begin with the bad news, which is that all the things we said were going to happen back in the 1980s are now happening and in spades. And someplace around the world, every day now, something truly terrible is underway that couldn't have happened in the first part of our lives because the physics of the planet wouldn't have produced it. 3 weeks ago, when Hurricane Melissa hit Jamaica, as we measured the wind speed as it was making landfall 600 feet above sea level, the wind was blowing 252 miles an hour. That's the highest wind speed we've ever seen in a hurricane, and that's because we've superheated the waters of the ocean, and hence they can provide more energy to those great storms. That same day, in central Vietnam, we had the largest rainfall that we've ever recorded on the planet. In 24 hours, it rained 5 feet. Okay? So remember Hurricane Irene, when we had the worst rainfall in Vermont history, and remember the damage it caused. The highest rainfall total from Hurricane Irene was about 11 inches, 24-hour period. This was more than 5 times that much rain. And just to remind us that history never goes away, one of the things that happened in Vietnam was that a lot of unexploded landmines and ordnance left over from our wars in Southeast Asia washed down out of the mountains into people's fields and again where they have to deal with them. The systemic damage that we have done to the planet already is very, very large. We can see it in events like that, and we can see it in big, big, big changes. So the jet stream, probably the biggest physical force on the planet, draws its power from the temperature difference between the equator and the poles. We've raised the temperature at the poles very dramatically, and so now the jet stream gets stuck in strange positions, unlike anything from our lifetimes. This early season cold that we've had in the lower 48 the last couple of weeks is a result of the fact that it's 40 degrees warmer than it should be at the North Pole, a huge and unprecedented hot air mass that's pushing cold air down here. Off in the Atlantic, those great currents, the Gulf Stream and the other Atlantic currents, are beginning to flicker and falter because fresh water pouring off of melting Greenland is changing the salinity and hence the density of the North Atlantic. And it's those density differences that drive those giant conveyor belt currents that are the biggest heat distribution engine on the planet. On and on and on. Many, many things going wrong on our planet right now in very unprecedented ways. Raising the temperature of the Earth is the biggest thing that humans have ever done. It's entirely our doing, and it's really been done in our lifetimes. If you're 75, you've been alive for more than 80% of human carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So this is the main thing that, taken as a whole, our generations have accomplished on this Earth, is to alter the atmospheric chemistry of the planet. This is the thing that, 1,000 years and 5,000 years and 10,000 years from now, people will know about our time on Earth, unless we do some very good things very quickly. I'll add, and here I risk being more political than the occasion perhaps portends, I'll add for a minute that I also think it's a very dark moment in our country, one that I don't understand and don't feel any real precedent for in my whole lifetime. The President of the United States yesterday called for the hanging of 6 members of Congress because he didn't like something they said. I don't have a real frame of reference for how to deal with that because it's so different from and so many things are so different, exemplified perhaps by watching the President just decide on his own accord that it would be nice to tear down a large portion of the White House. But that reflects in on these other questions I want to talk about because questions around climate and democracy, I think, are tightly intertwined. So with that very depressing beginning, let me say that there is one very big good thing happening on this planet all of a sudden, and that I think it's big enough and good enough that it perhaps gives us a chance to take some bite out of both the climate crisis and the authoritarianism crisis, if you will. And that one big thing is the very, very rapid, sudden spike in the use of clean energy from the sun and the wind around the planet. When I talk about energy from the sun, the first thing that comes to mind are photovoltaic panels catching the sun's rays, and that's a huge part of it. But wind energy also is just a reflection of the fact that the sun heats the earth differentially producing the winds that turn those majestic turbines. So think of it all in some level as solar energy. We've called this stuff our whole lifetimes alternative energy. It's always been around. You've always known, there's always been somebody in Vermont with a solar panel up on the roof or whatever, but it's always seemed pretty marginal and at the fringe and not really central. That changed about 5 years ago. About 5 years ago, we crossed some invisible line where it became cheaper to generate energy from the sun and the wind than from burning coal and gas and oil. That's a pretty epochal, revolutionary moment in the history of our species, because setting stuff on fire has basically been what humans have done, the archaeologists tell us, for about 700,000 years. First, we set wood on fire and had campfires all the time, which was good. We learned to cook food. That helped give us the big brain. We were able to move north and south from the equator. The raw weather outside today is a good reminder that absent fire, Chittenden County would probably not be a very good place to live. The anthropologists even think that standing around a campfire every night for eons helps explain some of the social bonds that mark our species. Think of it as a kind of proto-Zoom, or something. And then when we learned to control the combustion of coal and gas and oil, we called that the Industrial Revolution, and it produced modernity and everything around us. But now it's coming at a very high price. The biggest part of that price is the destruction of the climate, because burning coal and gas and oil puts the carbon in the air that traps heat. But there are other prices too. One of them is a lot of people die every year. 9 million on this planet, about 1 death in 5 from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel, all the particulates that lodge in people's lungs. There's 5 million school children in New Delhi, for instance. 2.5 million of them have irreversible lung damage from breathing the air. Okay? And then the third problem, big problem, I think, with fossil fuel right now is just that as long as we depend on an energy source that's only available in a few places, the people who control those places end up with way too much wealth and power, which they routinely abuse. We saw yesterday in the White House the king of Saudi Arabia basically making jokes about the fact that he cut up a columnist for the Washington Post a few years ago. The oil and gas baron of Europe, Vladimir Putin, is using his winnings to launch a land war in Europe in the 21st century, on and on and on. So it would be very nice if we could do something else, and now we can. 90% of new electric generation around the world last year came from sun and wind and batteries. No longer alternative energy in any way. The obvious, common sense, straightforward way to power the planet. And the numbers from the places that have taken leadership on this are astonishing. China is doing much of the heavy lifting here. They're the biggest player in this clean tech revolution. In May, the Chinese were putting up 3 gigawatts of solar panels a day. A gigawatt's the rough equivalent of a big coal-fired power plant. So they were building one of those out of solar panels every 8 hours. Okay? It's astonishing to watch what's happening there. But it's happening in other places too, some of them closer to home. California, which took this seriously, is past some kind of tipping point maybe 18 months ago. Now most days in California, they generate more than 100% of their electricity from renewable power for long stretches of the day. At night when the sun goes down, the biggest source of supply on the grid in California is batteries that have been soaking up excess sunshine all afternoon. California, and this is a very, very hopeful statistic, is using this year 40% less natural gas to produce electricity than they were 2 years ago. California is the 4th largest economy in the world, so this is a big deal. The state that's now surpassed California in supplying clean energy is Texas, which is odd since it's the center of the hydrocarbon industry, but it's also a firm, devout believer in free market economics and the fact that this stuff is the cheap way to build a big, stable grid is so far won out in the Lone Star State. Around the world, we can see this starting to happen in place after place after place. Some of them quite poor. Pakistan, for instance, which has suffered more from climate change probably than any country on earth. The 2 biggest floods since Noah in 2010 and 2022. The last one, about 1/3 of the country underwater. In the summer now, it routinely gets into the 120s in Pakistan's major cities. But they do have one geographic advantage, a border with China, and across that border have come endless amounts of solar panels over the last couple of years. It's not a government program. It's just people tired of expensive and unreliable electric grid, buying solar panels, going on YouTube to figure out how to snap them together. They've put up the equivalent of the country's existing electric grid in solar panels in the last 3 years. It's really astonishing to see. And some in places, and that's, by the way, in the last 6 months, that's now happening in much of Africa, following kind of Chinese trade routes. You can just watch as country after country suddenly has this huge surge in solar energy. In the case of Africa, in many places, this is the first electricity that people have ever had. Coal might as well not have existed, oil, gas, for all the good it ever did them. They're getting their first power from the sun. But there are also places that look a lot like us that are doing remarkable things. Australia, which is a pretty good analog for America in terms of its latitude, its GDP per capita, its level of education, all those things. They've put up enough solar power in Australia now that the government announced a few weeks ago, beginning January of next year, all Australians will get 3 free hours of electricity every afternoon. You can schedule your dishwasher and your washing machine to run then. You can charge your electric vehicle. You can buy a cheap, or now quite cheap, storage battery, fill it up with free electricity in the afternoon, and use it to run your house all night. Human beings, as I said before, for the last 700,000 years have been working pretty hard to get energy. You have to, the time it took to go collect firewood, the money it takes to pay the guy who's delivering the oil to your furnace, whatever else. That's no longer really need be the case, as Australia demonstrates. Australians will now essentially have energy for free. And if we're worried about affordability and that kind of thing, this is the remarkable news. Now, in order to deal with the climate crisis, we need this transition to happen very quickly, because the climate crisis is happening very quickly. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, our scientific authorities, told us a couple of years ago that if we wanted to stay on anything like the timeline that we'd set out in Paris just a decade ago, we would need to cut emissions in half by 2030, which by my watch is now 4 years and about 6 weeks away. Okay, so that would be a hard task, even if everybody was working in good faith on this. Okay? Because there's a lot of inertia, and there's a lot of installed systems that have to be overcome. I mean, most people in this room have an internal combustion car. It may need to be replaced sometime in the next 4 years? And if it is, in a working, rational world, we'd be replacing it with an electric vehicle, because not only are they better for the environment, they're much nicer cars to drive. I've driven one for years, and I wouldn't go back if you paid me a large sum of money. It's quiet, it accelerates fast, it has almost no moving parts, so you don't have to go to the mechanic very often, and you just fill it up, at night in your garage with a plug. The gas station for me is now just the place where you go to get Diet Coke. That's it. But even if everybody was working in good faith, this would be hard. But the problem for Americans is that not everyone is working in good faith. This clean energy revolution is a huge boon to almost everybody on planet Earth, okay? Except people who own oil wells and coal mines. And for them, it's an extraordinary threat to their wealth. And in our political system, I don't mean to sound cynical here, but having a lot of money allows you to play an outsized role in our political system. So a year ago, candidate Trump said in a not very secret meeting with oil executives, if you give me $1 billion in donations, I will give you whatever you want. They gave him about $500 million altogether, and that turned out to be plenty, because in the last 9 months, we've seen the United States become the one country on earth that's trying assiduously to go in the opposite direction. We didn't just end all the kind of support and subsidy that Biden had put in place for solar power and EVs and things. The president stopped construction on a wind farm off the coast of New England that was 80% complete. 3 weeks ago in Nevada, they shut down work on what would have been the largest solar farm in America. One solar farm in Nevada that would have provided enough power for 2 million homes. There's 300,000 homes in Vermont, so this one solar farm would have been enough to power Vermont 6 times over, okay? But we can't have it because the fossil fuel industry doesn't want it. And on and on and on and on. So we've set out to try and build as best we can popular support for making this clean energy transition everywhere that we can. That's why we did this thing we called Sunday, not Earth Day, but Sunday in September, and it was a huge success. We had about 500 events all across the country. That's the logo for Sunday, half a sun, because the point is we're halfway there. We have the technology. What we lack is the political will to put it in place. But we put up on the website this tool at the website where you can go and help with this. It's called sunday.earth. We put up this tool that allowed people to complete the drawing, and 10,000 people or so have drawn their version of what this logo should look like. There was the one that Jane Fonda drew for us and sent in on and on. Here's what it looked like across the country as people were engaging in this day of action. I was down in New York City at the kind of headquarters of this. But just beautiful, beautiful scenes all over the place. People were making a number of important arguments. Some of them were about the necessary practical need because of climate change to make this shift. Some of them were talking about the economics. about the fact that they'd like to live in a place like Australia where you could get energy essentially for free. And some of them were talking about all the things that keep us from embracing as wholeheartedly as we should this set of possibilities. I think there are two big reasons that people sometimes say they don't want to do this. One is they fear that there's so much mining and materials and things that'll be required to build solar panels and things that we might as well not even bother trying. It turns out that's not true. And then if you think about it for a little while, you start to figure out why. We definitely have to go mine some lithium and some cobalt and things to build batteries and solar panels, but it's a lot less mining than we do now. If you go mine some lithium, you put it in a battery or a solar panel, and there it stays for 25 years doing its job. And when that battery degrades, now we know how to recycle them and take that valuable lithium out and start over again. If you go mine some coal, what do you do with it? Burn it, and then you have to go mine more the next day, okay? So the Rocky Mountain Institute said in a study last year that all the mining required for the renewable energy battery revolution by 2050 would be less than the volume of coal we mined last year on this planet. So not a free lunch, but a much less expensive lunch than we're eating at the moment. A way to kind of hold this in your mind is to remember that one boatload of solar panels coming, being imported from someplace, will in its lifetime produce more than 100 times as much energy as that same boat filled with coal. A huge, huge difference. The other reason I think sometimes is that people worry that we're going to use too much land putting up solar panels and wind turbines. And it's true that we're going to have to use some. The best guess all around the world is something like 2% of the land surface of the planet to provide this energy that we need and use. But I think we shouldn't worry too much about that. I think this is a crop very much worth cultivating. Some of it can go on our rooftops and over our parking lots and things like that, and it should. And some of it should go in cleared land, agricultural land. If you think about the United States, for instance, our biggest crop in this country is corn. We grow 60 million acres of it. I live in Addison County. We grow a lot of corn in Addison County. Of that 60 million acres, 30 million acres, or half, is already used for producing energy because that corn gets turned into ethanol, which we then blend into our gasoline. Okay? 30 million acres, but we don't get very much out of it. We get about 3% of our energy supply. But if you covered that same 30 million acres in solar panels, you'd get closer to 100% of our current energy demand. We don't want to do it that way because we don't want to just cover Iowa stem to stern with solar panels, but it goes to show that we have room to maneuver here. I was in a cornfield in Illinois summer before last as I was reporting this book, and I was talking with a farmer who was converting some of his land from corn to solar panels. And he said, here's an acre that's still in corn and we use it for ethanol. We grow enough in a year to drive my Ford F-150, most popular vehicle in America for the last 40 years, drive it 25,000 miles. Okay, so not nothing. But here's an acre right next to it that I've converted to solar panels. It produces enough electrons in a year to drive the EV version of the same pickup truck, the Ford F-150 Lightning, not 25,000 miles, but 700,000 miles. Okay? And I don't have to pour nitrogen and phosphorus on it to make the solar panels work, which is a good thing. We know all too well from Lake Champlain what happens when you pour nitrogen and phosphorus over and over again on your farm field. And I don't have to strafe it with herbicides and pesticides to make it work. In fact, I'm left with half the field, the rows in between the solar panels, to work with. Those rows between solar panels are the sort of blank slate for this entirely new human form of creativity that we're calling by the very awkward name now of agrovoltaics, which just means growing things between solar panels. And it turns out that that's a remarkably important thing to do sometimes. Solar panels are providing not just electrons, but they're providing shade. And on an overheating planet, shade can be a very useful thing, above all because it retains moisture. So in China, where they've had huge problems with spreading deserts, blowing huge sandstorms into Beijing, the first thing that's finally begun to slow them down are these solar farms. They retain moisture, allowing the desert to regrow that fragile biotic crust that holds the sand in place. In many places, they're growing crops. The French vintners have found that they can get yields from their wine grapes up as much as 60% when they're growing them in and among solar panels. I'm a beer guy, so this means nothing to me. But in Vermont, what we are doing, I spent a day, a really wonderful day in this book, out with a couple from Middlebury, Mike and Tanya Kernan, who set up this nonprofit some years ago called Be the Change, that's been planting pollinator-attracting weeds and flowers in between these panels. It works for the solar farm because you only have to mow them once a year, and it works for the landscape because they're attracting huge numbers of insects, 100 times more than the field of agricultural field that they replaced. Turns out that there were lots of wasps and flies and things that we thought had been extirpated from Vermont, gone locally extinct. Somehow, as soon as these guys planted these weeds and flowers and things, all these insects somehow heard about it and showed back up. 100 times more, which means that the surrounding farmers are seeing big increases in fruit set in the orchards and things like that. They're solving some of the biodiversity crisis at the same time as some of the climate crisis. So when you drive up and down Route 7 or Route 100 or whatever and see some of those solar farms, think of the real beauty that they represent, you know. And I think that that beauty is an important part of this story. As I said earlier, I stole the title from this book from George Harrison. And if you go to Spotify, it turns out that Here Comes the Sun is by far the most popular song in the Beatles' vast catalog. More people around the world listen to it every day than any other song the Beatles ever wrote, and the Beatles are about the most popular group there ever was. Partly that's because it's a beautiful and optimistic song in a dark time, and partly because it's about the sun. Humans have a deep connection to the sun. You can see it in music. We did a playlist for Sunday of songs about the sun, and we came up with hundreds of them. Every musician you can think of has written a great song about the sun, and I bet you could just, sitting here, name 10 of them. Turns out to be a longer list than the great songs about fracking, you know, in the musical catalog. We don't know how prehistoric people thought about the sun, because being prehistoric, they neglected to write down what they were thinking, but they did leave behind lots of piles of rocks, like Stonehenge and things, and all of them point to the equinox or the solstice. You know, they were clearly the minute that we started having mythologies that we do sort of know about from oral or written history, the first thing that in every culture the mythologists had to explain was, how does this thing rise over here in the morning, set over here in the afternoon, and get back over here again by next morning? So there's hundreds of great stories about giant turtles and emus that swallowed the sun and vomited up again the next morning, and on and on and on, you know. I started writing this book in a way because the spring before last, you'll recall, we had this eclipse in Vermont. And it was, you know, people crowded in from across New England into Vermont. This was the largest traffic jams in our history. But they were very friendly traffic jams because everybody was so taken by this spectacle. I was on the quad at Middlebury, where I teach sometimes, and there were 1,500 students out there, and all of them put down their phones for a good half hour to watch this spectacle unfold. And it was just, to me, a reminder of how deep our connection with the sun is. I was over in the Vatican in September because the new Pope had summoned some people over for a conference to mark the 10th anniversary of Pope Francis's Laudato Si encyclical about climate change. And it was a very good gathering, and the new Pope, who, I mean, it's very odd to have a kind of strangely normal American as the Pope. I mean, if this guy showed up at your Thanksgiving, you know, wearing his White Sox cap, you'd just think he was your bachelor uncle who had, you know, made it a completely weirdly normal human being. But he made it clear that he was going to follow Francis in all these ways that he'd worked on climate change. In fact, the Vatican will become next year the first fully solar nation on Earth. They've built a big solar farm outside Rome, and they're going to flip the switch in a few months. And so in my talk, I said, I think this is all, though I'm not a Catholic, I'm right at home here, and I'm a Methodist. I said, I think this is all incredibly good news, and I think our mantra from here on forward should be energy from heaven, not from hell, you know. And I think the Pope more or less blessed this motto, so I was feeling good. The beauty of all of this, I think, is enormous. The possibility of this transformation. I have a new grandson, my first. So I now deeply love someone who will be alive in the 22nd century. And figuring out how to make that century have some possibility of really working, maybe even of being better than the world we live in, is really important to me. Let me end by saying, I'm sure I leave some time for questions and things, that I think people in our age cohort have a particularly important role to play in making this happen, and making it happen fast. It'll happen eventually. 40 years from now, we'll probably run the world on sun and wind just because it's so cheap. But if it takes us 40 years to get there, it'll be a broken world that we run on sun and wind. The Gulf Stream will have collapsed. The jet stream will be in tatters. There'll be, you know, every manner of disaster all the time. To speed it up, we need lots of political action, lots of pressure. You can see that here in Vermont. I mean, we think of ourselves as a very green place, but Vermont's had a de facto moratorium on wind power for the last 15 years because enough people said, basically, I don't want to look at it, that we stopped doing it after we built the set over on Lowell Mountain. That's bad. That's wrong. And I think that, you know, there are times when I think that Vermont's, I mean, I love Vermont very much, but there are times when I fear that our state motto should be, change anything you want once I die, you know. And I don't think that we can do that anymore. I've spent much of my life working with young people, and that's been great. We started this thing we called 350.org with myself and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury about 20 years ago. And it became the biggest climate campaign on the planet. We've organized 20,000 demonstrations and rallies and things in every country on earth except North Korea. And inspired lots of other young people to get involved, and they're amazing. You know, I've gotten to know and love people like Greta Thunberg, who's one of my favorite people to work with on the planet, the Swedish schoolgirl who really started much of this agitation. The only problem with all that great work by young people was that I heard too many people my age saying, oh, it's up to the next generation to solve this problem, which is slightly immoral and highly impractical. For all their energy and intelligence and idealism, young people by themselves lack the structural power that we need in order to make change on the scale that's required in the short time that we have. If you look around for who has structural power in our society, a big chunk of it lies with older Americans. If you've reached the age where you have hair coming out your ears, then you have structural power coming out your ears too. There's 70 million Americans over the age of 60. We punch above our weight because everybody in this room voted in the last election. There's no known way to stop old people from voting, okay? We have lots of connections built up over the years, lots of skills, and lots of time. And those are things that are extraordinarily valuable. So that's why we started this thing we call Third Act 4 years ago, to organize people over the 60 for action on climate and democracy. And it's gone very well. We have about 100,000 people around the country now engaged in this work. Very, very active and effective working groups in most states, including a wonderful one here in Vermont. If you go to thirdact.org and sign up and put in your zip code, you'll be connected quickly to people around here who are doing fantastic, fantastic work. One of the important parts of that work is making sure that young people understand that they have some backup and support. There's a lot of climate anxiety and climate despair and just generalized despair among younger people now in this country and on this planet. Some of that's because of the genuine fear of the deep problems that we're facing, but more of it, in my sense, is because young people feel that they've been abandoned to face those problems by themselves, that earlier generations took most of what was the easy, good stuff and left them behind with some real dilemmas with which to grapple. So it's great fun to get to join forces. The first demonstration we did at Third Act, just as we were getting started, was because some young people from a group called Fridays for the Future, which is kind of offshoot of Greta's youth movement in the United States, called me up and said, we want to go after the big banks, Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that are the biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry. We want to go protest there, but we don't have checking accounts or credit cards or anything yet. Will you help? And I was like, well, if there's anything we have, it's credit cards, So yes, we will help. And the first demonstration we did was in Boston, down at Downtown Crossing down there outside the Chase Bank. And when I showed up, there were 300 or 400 high school kids. High school kids very much understand the barrel of the gun down which they're staring, And the high school kids are somewhat sprier, so they were at the head of the march. But at the back, there was a big bunch of us from this beginning Third Act thing, and we just had a banner that said, "Fossils against fossil fuels," okay? And all the kids who saw it were like laughing and saying thank you very much for doing this. We've gone on to do all this work around climate and around democracy, and we think it's been somewhat effective. We were, if any of you went to the No King's Day protest, say, around here, you may have noticed that our age cohort was overrepresented, which is good, a few weeks ago, Stephen Miller, the president's henchman, I don't even know what you would call him, said he was giving reporters a tour of the newly militarized Washington, D.C., and pointing out all the troop-carrying trucks and, you know, assault rifle-carrying National Guardsmen, and it was all great, great, great. He said, the only problem we're having is that all these elderly hippies keep coming out and screaming at us about it, you know, and they should just go home and take a nap, was what he said. And we were very much clear. We put out a press release immediately saying, we do not plan on taking a nap. We plan on continuing to stand up as best we can here. So it's been really, really fun and well, just kind of joyful sometimes to do this work, even in the midst of what is a very, very, I think, dark moment. There's plenty of days nights when I wake up at 3 in the morning and cannot get back to sleep, just sort of thinking about where we are now and trying to figure out what to do about it and how to make it work. But it is very good to have people to work with from all over the country and to see older people really asserting their abilities, their power, their cohesion, their generational kind of muscle memory. If you're in your third act now, if you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s, your first act was back in those moments of real cultural, social, political transformation in this country, when we started taking women seriously in public life, the apex of the civil rights movement, the first Earth Day in 1970, when 20 million Americans, 10% of the then population, was out in the streets. We know that we've been able to do this before in our society, and now we need to do it again. And I'll just end by saying, almost everyone in this room is going to live long enough to see, you know, the crucial moments. I mean, we're talking about the end of this decade as the crucial deadline for having made real progress or not on what we need to do. We're talking about the next couple of elections as the ones that will decide how much democracy remains in our country. It is a truly remarkable moment to be around and to be shaping our legacy. So I'm really grateful to you all for just being engaged in the world, as evidenced by your presence here today. And I hope that you all figure out lots of ways to be engaged in this fight in the next few years. It's going to be crucial. Thank you all very much. And I know we have to stop exactly at the top of the hour, and as I say, I have to get off to the ferry at Charlotte myself, but questions, comments, critique, abuse, whatever you have in mind would be fine. You're in charge here.
We have a question over there.
Thank you so much. I'm thinking about two companion challenges that we have in addition to the climate change. One is human population on this earth, and the other is the income disparity that we have. And I think those are all three related.
I agree with
that. I was
that.
wondering how do we address climate change without addressing those other two
Sure.
challenges?
So human population is a really interesting question. I wrote a book about it many years ago called Maybe One. Here's a place where we can really share good news. 40 years ago on this planet, the average woman had 6 children. That number is now 2.2 and continuing to fall. So we have bent the curve of human population in truly dramatic ways. The total population will go up a little bit over the next few decades because there's still people coming into their childbearing years. There's what the demographers call demographic momentum. But that curve of fertility has been broken. And it was broken mostly by people in the developing world. And what they figured out was that if you could empower and educate women to almost any degree, fertility would change dramatically. Why? Because it turns out that given any choice in the matter, most women don't actually want to have 6 children. They'd rather have 2. And so that curve has finally shifted in dramatic ways. The hope is that we could figure out how to shift the curves of consumption and of carbon production and things in somewhat the same ways. That's more tied into this question around inequality, which I think is very, very powerful. One of the things that I like about renewable energy, clean energy, is that you can't hoard it or hold it in reserve for things. If we think about where great wealth in our society originally came from, the very first plutocrat that we know about, the archetype that's been followed by the Musks and the Zuckerberg, was John D. Rockefeller. He figured out that if you controlled the supply of oil, you'd be very, very rich. And there are tens of thousands of subsidiary Rockefeller types spread out around the planet. So one way to eat away at that grotesque inequality is to supplant this necessary commodity, energy, with energy that's available to everyone, everywhere, all the time. Vermont spends $2 billion a year on fossil fuel, Vermonters. Even though we're a small place, $2 billion. We just write a check, essentially, and send it to Texas and Saudi Arabia every year for a couple of $1 billion. Think about what Vermont would be like if that money was staying close to home, which it could easily be. You begin to get some sense of the shift away. And you really see it when you get to very poor places in the world where the need to buy fossil fuel in American dollars is the thing that causes economy after economy to collapse. When we hear about balance of payment crises and countries going into debt crisis and stuff, generally because they have to come up with the money for the next tanker load of oil that's swinging at anchor out in their harbor. This doesn't solve the entire inequality problem, but it's one of the steps forward that I think is really powerful. The other thing that would also work is to do, what my friend Bernie routinely suggests, which is to tax the hell out of people who have billions of dollars. It seems like a fairly straightforward approach, and one that I highly recommend. So.
We have about 40 people on Zoom, so can we read one of the questions coming from them?
Hello?
There you are.
Okay. What produces the sun's heat and light?
What produces the sun's heat and light? That's a good question. The sun is the largest nuclear reactor that we know about. It's busily turning hydrogen into helium at astonishing rate, and it produces way more energy than we will ever possibly use. Thousands, across the planet every day washes thousands of times as much energy as humans would ever even think of being able to use. It's an astonishing gift. The sun, remember, already gives us light, as you point out, and warmth, and via photosynthesis it provides our supper, and now it's willing to provide much of the power that we could ever use. So it's all a pretty good deal, I gotta say.
You had said earlier that it's now become cheaper to produce energy from the sun than from fossil fuels. So my question is, to what extent is government needed to increase production of energy from the sun?
It's a good question.
Financing it? regulatory end.
It's a very good question. So let's think about it in both those ways. On the financing end, the problem with renewable energy is that all the cost is up front. You have to put up the solar panel. Once you've got it up, the energy comes for free. Okay? So that's what the Biden administration with that IRA thing was trying to do. Provide some of the money for that upfront investment to get you over that first hurdle. We're not going to do that now. We've taken all that money away. And therefore, probably the most useful thing governments can do at the moment is start figuring out how to get out of the way. It costs 3 or 4 times as much in this country to put a solar panel on your roof as it does in Australia or the EU. That's a little bit because of tariffs on panels, but mostly because we have way more bureaucracy. There are 15,000 municipalities in this country, each one with its own building code. Each one would like to send a team of inspectors to go look at your roof for a while and things, which is unnecessary. It's not how it works around the rest of the world. The rest of the world, you call up Monday morning and say, I want solar power by Friday. You know, it's up on your roof, pumping out, and it costs way, way less. So there are a couple of things we can do about that. There's this thing that the National Renewable Energy Lab produced a couple of years ago called the Solar App Plus. It's an app that allows for instant permitting. Your contractor types in your address and the kind of equipment he wants to put on your roof, and if the computer likes the match, then it grants him an instant permit and he's up at work. California, Maryland, and New Jersey have now adopted this. Okay? For those who live in apartments without a roof, the thing that's exploded across Europe in the last couple of years is this thing that's called balcony solar. Millions and millions of Europeans have gone to whatever you call the Best Buy in Italy and come home with a solar panel for a few €100 designed just to be hung over the railing of a balcony. And on the back, it just has a standard plug that you stick in the wall, and it provides 20%, 25% of the power that a household uses. So not everything, but not nothing either. That's illegal everywhere in this country, except that progressive bastion, the state of Utah, whose legislature, by unanimous vote in both houses in March, passed the enabling legislation. On the argument, I've had a long talk with the Libertarian Republican state senator who introduced the legislation, and he said, well, if it's good enough for the people of Stuttgart, it's good enough for the people of Provo, you know? And so now you can go on YouTube and watch lots of pictures of happy Utahns putting their balcony solar thing up. Since Sunday, we've had introduced in about 20 state legislatures this plan for plug-in or balcony solar, including in Vermont, where it's being championed by several legislators and where VPIRG, Vermont Public Interest Research Group, is sort of doing a lot of the heavy lifting. This is the easiest possible kind of change. You know, it doesn't cost anything. It just makes it easier to do, and it just is a way to kind of start overcoming that inertia. So this is the sort of thing, you know, all of you know who your state senator and state rep is. 3 or 4 letters about this are enough to, you know, make sure that it's on their agenda when we get back to Montpelier in January. You know, this is the kind of thing we need to do fast. It's not everything, but it's a big start. Right down front here? Or, well,
what do you think would be the good things that we could do here in Vermont to get the legislature to work on right now?
Those are probably the 2 most immediate things, because, you know, Vermont at the moment lacks money to do much of its own financing of things. But we should be going out of our way to make sure that we do all the things that someone else is going to pay for, whether it's someone who wants to put solar on their roof or their balcony, or someone who wants to build a solar farm. We have proposals for lots of solar farms in Vermont, but they routinely get overruled by either local objections or by the state public service board, who, you know, have rejected just last year, big solar farm in Manchester solely on aesthetic grounds. It met every other on this long list. Just we don't want to look at it. You know, the trees won't grow up quickly enough to shield the view from this thing. I think that's no longer okay. And I think it's no longer okay that we just maintain this de facto moratorium on wind power. It really just comes because our legislators don't want to take on the very noisy minority who sort of browbeat them on this 10 or 15 years ago. And it's crazy. Wind, we don't have to put windmills on every rooftop, but you know, the first industrial wind turbine in America was built in 1943 on Grandpa's Knob down in the Taconics in Vermont, about 30 miles south of where I live. In fact, I didn't really say this, but it's we're running over here, aren't we? I'll just finish by saying, for patriotic Americans, we should take seriously the fact that we're now ceding the technological and economic future to China. All of this stuff was invented here. The first solar cell was 1954 at Bell Labs in Edison, New Jersey. There are people in this room who were dropping dimes in payphones in the 1950s. And if you were, then you helped finance the first solar cell the world has ever seen, okay? And the fact that we're just in the course of 9 months handing it all over to the Chinese should be, I mean, it's the biggest self-surrender that the world has ever seen. I don't understand it. I don't understand a lot of things, but I try to work on the things that I can, and I hope you all will join in. Many, many thanks.
Bill, thanks for coming. And thank all of you for coming here. We'll see you next spring.